Hello indie game fans, one of my favourite indie games is the original Darkest Dungeon since everything from the art, atmosphere, narrator and gameplay was on point. Its sequel, currently in early access, did change things up quite a bit in terms of structure, so if that isn't exactly jiving with you, perhaps take a look at some of the best games like the original. Let's begin with Dungeon No Dungeon, a title that had a rough launch in early access, but in the 7 months or so since then, has gradually become better and better and is showing promise. On top of the great art and roguelite progression systems, the combat, a highlight for games like this, is where things are pretty interesting since you're able to target specific body parts of enemies, chopping off or maiming enemies which will severely limit their capabilities. As such, the flow of battle is quite different since your own characters are affected by this limb targeting system as well, but it is a clever alternative. Additionally, the sheer variety of character classes, even while in early access, is impressive, making this a title to keep an eye on. Our second entry is not an indie game since it comes to us from Krafton Inc., you know, the PUBG people, but it's a decent roguelite RPG with a grid-based dungeon exploration system. You're gathering a party of adventurers and venturing into something known as the Vortex, a mysterious realm from which horrible monsters spew forth, but they mysteriously vanished and the humans have decided to counterattack and to take the fight to them. The expected combat elements are there, with randomness in hit and miss chance, but I do like the designs and art, as well as the variety of playable characters. There is a doomsday clock-like mechanic, where every expedition that you go on does cause it to tick closer towards a game over scenario, so it has the dread of a Darkest Dungeon. But do be warned, it is a little punishing and not exactly the most perfectly balanced game, but a curiosity to check out for sure. One of the hidden gems in the space with fantastic art is Mad Crown, one that is set, interestingly, in a diesel punk post-apocalypse after humans have destroyed the world with nuclear weapons. That cataclysmic event resulted in godlike Leviathan creatures awakening from beneath the surface of the earth, and it is with this backdrop where our story begins, where rumours have begun to swirl about the existence of an artifact known as the Mad Crown with the power to rival these beings. The grid-based dungeon exploration element is interesting, since if your party does get wiped out, you do have a chance to recover their belongings on your next run, so it's a little bit more forgiving in that sense. However, it does come to us from a Chinese developer and some of the translations can be a little rough, but an interesting looking game nonetheless. Another title where the Darkest Dungeon inspiration is clear is WARSAW, a historical entry set in World War II, covering the ill-fated Warsaw Uprising and the heroes who fought tooth and nail. Playing as the remnants of the armed forces and civilian fighters, you are massively outnumbered and outgunned as you take on the Nazi forces. While the positional elements are present as per Darkest Dungeon, units are on a 2x4 grid instead of a 1x4 row, where elements like cover and flanking do come into effect as well. Another clear departure is that you need to spend a turn reloading weapons, where of course ammunition is pretty scarce, meaning that this is different enough to be worth a play. I'm not the biggest fan of the city exploration parts, but the combat is interesting and does come to us from a Polish developer who are sharing their history, which is something that I like to see in indie games. One of the best looking games in this subgenre that has its own unique art style is Vambrace Cold Soul, where our heroine travels to a cursed city, building an artifact known as the Aether Breeze, which gives her the power to fight against the King of Shades. The combat will be fairly familiar to fans of Darkest Dungeon, sporting the same familiar 4-character setup and side-scrolling dungeon exploration, but thus added some additional features like a turn order bar such that you can plan accordingly. This comes to us from Korean developer CLEMMYGAMES, who are perhaps better known for their Coma series of horror games, where this influence is shown in the art style, which is more akin to Korean manhwa rather than Japanese anime. Some information in battle is obscured, coupled with translation issues, makes this not as polished as its inspiration, but something of interest nonetheless. Another game where the Darkest Dungeon inspiration is clear is Deep Sky Derelicts, a sci-fi entry where your team is boarding abandoned spacecrafts, hoping to find something worth salvaging as they seek their riches, but more often than not, end up running into alien creatures and hostile forces. The node-based exploration does slow down the game just a little, since there is an energy resource that you need to manage, but the combat here is the highlight. The sci-fi classes are pretty varied and interesting, even having a deck-building, card-based element to contend with, but I just love the presentation and zoom-ins of the attacks. Since launch, there are 2 new paid DLCs, which adds more content, but if you're on the fence, certainly check out the base game first. I was mulling over where to put Banners of Ruin, since this is a roguelike RPG with deck-building elements like Slay the Spire, but since I ended up putting Deep Sky Derelicts on the list, this will be as well. It is set in a brutal, low-fantasy world filled with anthropomorphic animals. Think Red Wall meets Game of Thrones, where warring animal houses vie for supremacy and you play as one such group, infiltrating an enemy stronghold in order to cripple their leadership. Combat here is structured with a front and back row, but where it gets interesting is that every single character in your party draws their own set of cards and have the energy equivalent for every turn, meaning that essentially, one round of battle here can be up to 6 times as long as in Slay the Spire. There are meta progression elements and unlocks to keep you playing, where I do like the brutality of the world here. One of the denser game experiences like Darkest Dungeon is the newly released Vambrace The Riven Realms, coming out of early access just last month, and is an open world RPG with randomized elements where you lead a travelling company across a post-apocalyptic wasteland caused by a magical sundering. It takes a while for the trailer to show off the combat, so do bear with it, but it is really so much more, with trade and commerce, diplomacy and allegiances, as well as a narrative choose-your-own-adventure component. It is more akin to a single-player D&D campaign, but the combat is similar, and even though this game is on the pricier end of things, I do still think that it's worth a play.
Work harder, kill harder!
Let's get to work!
One of the great-looking pixel art titles of the year is Legend of Keeper's Career of a Dungeon Master, being a roguelike RPG like Darkest Dungeon, but where it gets interesting is that you play as the villains, having to fend off greedy adventurers from stealing your treasure. On top of monsters, you have spells and traps at your disposal, as well as your so-called hero character in the Dungeon Master, each specializing in a specific area. This gives the game a very interesting reversal of roles, which is always something that I appreciate when games allow you to do that. Additionally, the meta progression, upgrade and unlock system is very compelling as well, making this a no-brainer pick. I love playing as necromancers in games ever since my first exposure to the concept in Heroes of Might and Magic 2, and solidified with Diablo 2, so of course, Errata's Lord of the Dead got my attention even while in early access, and since its 1.0 release in 2020, a paid DLC titled Wrath of the Necromancer did come out as well, which contains the final chapter of the game. This is a pretty brutal roguelike turn-based RPG where you're literally creating undead monstrosities out of the parts harvested from your enemies to be used in combat where positioning matters. There are also plenty of upgrade and crafting systems as you make Errata's ever stronger, all in a bid to get his revenge against the forces that sealed him away many years ago. As such, given the quality of this game and the amount of content, it takes the #1 spot. For more roguelite or RPG titles, watch these videos and I will see you after the jump.
Mountain of human heads when I'm done.